All right, so this is going to be our little crash course into SQL Server. Now, I'm using SQL Server 2008. Now, we know the latest version right now is 2014. The stuff we're going to talk about here is so basic that it runs across all platforms. So we're going to get into the basics of understanding SQL Server because we need to understand this platform in order to be able to access it and create apps to access the data in this database in the coming weeks as we develop more code. Now, just to discuss this whole idea of what we're looking at here, this program is SQL Management Studio. Now, there's a reason why you're running SQL Management Studio here, and that's because it is a GUI interface to access the database engine itself, the SQL Server database engine. You see, what happens is that the database engine itself is just a program that runs in the background. And when you want to access it, you need to use some sort of client program that will allow you to access that database and be able to make changes to that database. So this program, Management Studio, is just a client program that can access the database. Okay, you could do this all at command line. You can find a command line utility. Well, it's bundled in to be able to access the same database engine, do the same things, right? If we look at MySQL, for example, there was phpMyAdmin, right? That's a web-based GUI that you could use to access MySQL databases, right? There's another one, Workbench. You could use to access databases. Access itself, Microsoft Access, is actually a client program to access a database, right? That's what it's there for. That's what it's geared for. But it does more scaled down databases. It's not as powerful as the program we're looking at right now. So let's talk about how we're going to get into the database. Okay. Now, the server name here depends on your system. You can use local with round brackets around it, and typically that will be good enough. Okay. Some of you may have issues with that. You may have error messages that pop up that say, "Oh, I cannot connect to this server." Right? So you may have to try something like SQL Express. Right? Or MS SQL Server. Right? You may have to try something like that. These names are called instance names. You can have multiple instances of an installation of SQL Server, and they could be subdivided to have different databases inside of them. It depends on what you're looking for. You could try local at first with round brackets around it, right? Or it may ask you for your computer name, right? So if your computer name is like XYZ slash, and that could be sufficient before the slash, right? That might make it okay to log in. It depends. Sometimes this program's a bit finicky. It really depends on your computer configuration. So then you could try XYZ slash SQL Express, right? Or MS SQL Server, right? So your computer name backslash either of those may work. If you're having issues, I'm going to stick to local for now. Okay? So it all depends. We can debug this as we go. Windows authentication. So it's saying authentication here. It's saying Windows authentication, meaning use my Windows login to log into this engine. Okay? If I hit the drop down, you have SQL Server authentication. That's the other option. We want to work with SQL Server authentication eventually, but for now, this is our first time logging in. So we're going to start with Windows authentication. And with that, username and password is grayed out. But once we get to SQL Server authentication, then username and password gets ungrayed out or enabled. And then we can actually type in a username and password. Why do we care? Because when we write applications to access this database, we don't want to use Windows authentication because that may involve divulging our username and password. We want to create a separate account with a separate password that we can provide in code so that we're not divulging our personal credentials, right? So we're keeping ourselves secure at the same time. We don't want the whole company knowing our password, right? That's the idea behind it. So we'll go with authentication. Let's look at the options a little bit here before we keep going. you can connect directly to a database, right? We have also additional parameters if we want to connect to. Now, why do we care about these additional parameters? Well, let's look at the server name again for a second. So again, this is a client, right? This is a client program. And we're just assuming that we're going to access our local installation, our local computers to access this database. But that's not necessarily needed. You could actually take a database somewhere around the world that you want to access and provide that IP address here. So for example, instead of local, I could say like 55.66.99.whatever / SQL Express or whatever the instance name is, right? And then I can go with my not Windows authentication, because usually that is disabled, but you would say SQL Server authentication. You would type in the username and password for that database server wherever it is in the world, all right? So you can access remote databases through this program just by knowing the username and password and the IP address, all right? But we won't do that today. We'll just stick to our local over here with Windows authentication, and we'll hit connect. And that'll bring us to this menu over here. Okay, so now if you're not able to get into it, then you want to look for the Services app. So if you're using Windows 10, in the search bar, you type in Services, and the Services desktop app will pop up. Otherwise, it's in the control panel, and this is what it looks like. All right, this is what it looks like. This tells you about all the running background services that you have going on your machine. And just stretch it out a bit there. Look for SQL Server. All right, and you want to look for SQL Server, and in round brackets, it'll tell you what instance name you're using. So I'm using MS SQL Server. That's mine. So I would not use SQL Express as my login. I would use MS SQL Server. Some of you, if you have like more than one installation, you might have both. You might have MS SQL Server, and you might also have another one below it that's also SQL Server, but has SQL Express in round brackets, and that's perfectly fine. But what you want to notice here on this line is the word running. This should be running. Okay, if it's blank, it means it's not running, which means you're never going to log in. So the trick is to right click on this and say start. Okay, if you're still having trouble, try a restart. Maybe that'll work. Maybe that'll help you. But you want to say start here and let it start. It's going to have a few dialog boxes come up. It'll say we're restarting. You know, it'll go through its motions to restart the server or to start the server in the first place. Okay, and so once this is started, once you see the word running, then you can close this and go back and try and log in again. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is configure SQL Server so that we can allow for separate logins and not have to rely on Windows authentication every time. What we're going to do is highlight our computer name or local, right? This very top line. We're going to right click on it and we're going to go down to properties. All right. By default, only Windows authentication is allowed. Okay. And we want to be able to create separate logins to log into this database engine. We're going to go to security, and you probably have Windows authentication mode highlighted. All right. That just says only Windows authentication is allowed. At installation time, this was what was set up. But the problem was that we could have set it there, but it was kind of forcing us to create a root password, which we could have done, but we left it alone at installation time. But right now, we can switch it to SQL Server and Windows authentication mode. It might say mixed mode, depending on the version you're using. That's okay. That's the same thing. We want to have this second bubble checked instead. Okay, we want to use SQL Server and Windows authentication mode. This allows us to do not only Windows logins, but also our own custom logins as well. All right, so we'll choose SQL Server and Windows authentication mode, and we'll hit OK. Now it's going to give us an error message, or not a message, a warning message that'll say you need to restart the server. So that's a message you should be receiving. Now, if to restart the server, I'm going to go back and highlight this. I'm going to right click, and I go to restart. And when I go to restart, a little pop-up message comes up that says, hey, I want to make changes. Say yes. And then another pop-up message is going to come up that says, are you sure you want to restart MS SQL Server on your computer? And you're going to say yes. And so then another dialog box pops up that says, hey, I'm restarting. Okay? So give it 30 seconds. It's going to restart. And then it'll come back to this exact same menu. Okay? You only have to do this once, right? Once per installation. So we've installed this for our first time. We're restarting, and we've set that mode. So now we don't have to redo it again. So now we're ready to go. We're ready to work with this thing. Okay? Now you'll notice that there's a bunch of folders here that we can work with. And what we're going to focus our attention on are the first two. So databases and security. Okay? The only two we're going to focus our attention on. If we expand databases, you'll notice that you'll have like system database. You might have a few extra. Or if it's a fresh installation, maybe you just have system. That's it. Right? I want to add a new database. So I'm going to call this, I'm going to right click on databases and say new database to add a new database. And I'm going to call this, all right, so I'm going to call this net class. Okay, so with our database created, we can just look here and we'll see net class, right? And if we expand net class, we'll have a bunch of other folders pop up here. Database diagram, table, views, programmability, storage, security. Let's start with tables. With tables, we only have one folder called system table. So let's add a couple of tables here. So I'm going to right click on tables and say new table. And a couple of windows are going to pop up here. First off, this is the space here in the middle where I'm going to start entering information to talk about my table. On the side here, you should have properties. This is convenient to have our properties. If you don't, you can go to View and Properties window, and it'll pop it up for you. It's a convenient window to have. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a table. We're going to call it user info, but we'll name it at the end. For now, user info is going to have like name, email, address, age, and that's good enough for now. So we're going to say our first column will be the ID column. So every table should have some sort of identifier, row identifier. So we're going to create that. That type will be an int. So if I look at my drop-down, there's a number of different types I can use. There's a lot here, right? All kinds. I'm just going to type in int, right? And I'm going to say no to allowing nulls. We want to make sure that this, which is eventually going to be our primary key, has no option to be null. Right? That could make things really bad for us. All right? So that's our first column. Next column, I'm going to call it name. And it'll be a varchar. I'm going to use varchar of max. Max is about 4,096 characters, roughly about that much. I'm going to say no to nulls. I'm using tab to tab along here. It's actually easy to use the tab button at this point. Next one is email. It's also varchar. I'll use max again. No nulls. And we'll say address. Varchar of max. No nulls. And age. Int. No null. That's good enough for now. We're going to come back and modify this table. I'm going to show you how to modify a table in a moment. But for now, we're not going to save this just yet. We're just going to look at our table here. We have an ID, which is an int. We have name, email, and address, which are varchars, okay, of size max. We have an age of size int. So we need to set the primary key. Okay, the way we set the primary key is first decide upon the primary key. We know it's going to be ID. ID is going to be our primary key, right? Next to ID and next to every column, there's a little space here. If I right click on that space, I can say set primary key. When I said set primary key, a little key appears here. This is my primary key, but we're not done yet. Because we not only want this to be our primary key, we want it to be set up such that it generates a number and it auto increments that every time we insert a row. So auto increment, essentially. So that's why we need our properties window on the side there. So we have the ID row highlighted, and if we go over to our properties window, we'll see this identity column text here. It's actually a drop down where we can choose from any integer based columns. So I'm going to choose ID in this identity column. Okay? At this point, I'm happy with the table. Okay? So we've set our primary key, we've set our identity column, so now this will auto increment every time I insert something into here. So I'm going to do a Control S, and it's going to ask me for a name, so Control S to save. I give it a name. I'm going to call it user info. And hit OK. And it's saving. And if I look at tables, user info is right there. Right? If you don't see user info, the table right here, just right click on tables and go refresh. Anytime you don't see something you just created, right click on that folder, go refresh, and it'll appear. So we have our first table. Let's do one more. So we'll right click on tables, go new table. This one's going to have some flight information. So we're going to start off with our ID column. So we'll say ID, int, no nulls, and next one is airline. We're going to say varchar of max, no nulls. Then we're going to say flight num. Notice I'm not using spaces in my names. If you use spaces in your names, it actually will introduce you to a lot of problems. Avoid using spaces in your names, in your table names, in your database names, in your column names. Avoid spaces at all costs. All right, because then the coding behind it gets very painful to work with, if at all, if it even works at all. Right? It'll accept spaces as in it won't complain. It'll accept it here, but you'll just be in for a world of hurt as you're writing some code to access this database. All right, so stick to no spaces. All right, flight num, we'll say varchar of 10. Flight numbers are usually pretty short, right? No nulls. And destination, we'll say varchar of max. No nulls. And finally, airplane type. And we'll say varchar of 50. No nulls. Okay? And identity column. So we got to set the primary key again. So look at ID, look at the space next to it, right click, set primary key. Right? So we've set the primary key here. Look at the properties under identity column, set this to ID. All right, so our ID column is going to be auto incremented for this table as well. And so now we can go ahead and do a Control S and save. Now you may find at times you do Control S and this doesn't appear. It's probably because you didn't highlight this area. All you do is click anywhere on this white space. All right, and then do Control S. Because it's probably thinking you're trying to save something over here with properties. Okay, so I'm going to call this table flight info. And it should generate a flight info table. If I expand either of these tables, you have another set of folders. If I expand columns, it'll show me all the columns with their types. So it's thinking. There we go. airline, flight num, destination. Same with user info, columns, name, email, address, and age. Now, I want to go back and I want to modify the user info table because I want to add in this flight number to that table. Like, at least be able to add that in. So let's close this off. Now, if I want to modify a table, the first thing I have to do is right-click on that table. So in this case, user info. I'm going to go to design. Right? Design will allow you to modify the table. So it's thinking, it's got my columns back. So now I'm just going to go back and add in one more column. All right? And I'm going to call this flight num. It's going to be an int. No nulls. Now, if I want to save this, I just do a Control S. And it worked. However, some of you may get an error that will complain that, hey, we're not allowed to save this updated table, right? That's okay. So before doing another save, there's actually a safeguard built into SQL Server that prevents this, prevents the modification of a table, usually when you have rows of information in there, just so that you don't corrupt your database. Right? They have a little safeguard in there. We're going to turn that off because we're going to walk on the wild side a little bit here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to Tools. We're going to go to Options. And we're going to go to Designer, which is the second last item here. And you should see a checkbox that says Prevent Saving Changes that require table recreation. Make sure this is unchecked. This by default is checked when you install. So we want to make sure this is unchecked. Okay? And then just hit OK. And you can go ahead and save now. Control S to save. So make sure you click on the white space here and just hit Control S and it'll save. And you can verify that that new column is in here by expanding user info and columns. And you should see, if you don't see it, that's okay. Just right click on columns and go refresh. And there's flight num. So now you have all your columns. Okay, so at this point we have covered how to create a database, how to create a table, how to modify a table. So the next step, the next logical step, is to actually insert some data into the database table. So what we want to do is we'll start off with the flight info and add some airlines and destinations to that table. So what we're going to do is we're going to right click on flight info and we're going to say edit top 200 rows. Okay? That number 200 is arbitrary. We'll talk about that in a sec. But edit top 200 rows. And so a new window pops up here and it has everything null. Right? So I'm going to start off by entering some information in. I'm going to ignore the ID column. I'm going to head straight to the airline. I'm going to type Air Canada. Flight num, let's just say AC799. Let's say destination Montreal. Let's say the airplane is an Airbus 320. And I'm hitting tab all along the way. Notice that there's red exclamation marks. Those red exclamation marks aren't an error. They're not saying there's something wrong. They're just saying that I haven't saved this data yet. I haven't flushed it to the database yet. All right, so it's unsaved data. That's the only reason. Also notice the ID, it's 1. So it already auto-generated my first ID number. Right? So let's add something else. Airline, United Airlines. We're going to say flight num is UA344 to San Francisco. Airplane is Boeing 777. So Boeing 777. Okay. Its ID number is 2. Let's add a couple more. Let's say US Airways. We're going to say this is US 122 to Phoenix. And we're going to say the airplane is a Boeing 737. Alright, its ID is 3. And then we'll do WestJet. And we'll say its flight num is WS766 to Calgary. And its airplane is a Boeing 747. And we'll do one more. This won't be British Airways. This will be a BA 566 to London on a Boeing 787. Alright? So we just entered some sample rows in. Alright? And each time I had a red circle come up. That was just again a warning that I hadn't flushed the data yet to the database. Now, if I had an issue with entering information in, when I hit that end of the row, it would have had a pop-up box come up and say, hey, this is invalid data. Okay? So that's usually when I get the error message. All right? But everything was very simple data, so no issues at all. So let's now enter some information for the other table. So I'm going to right-click on flight info, on user info, and say edit top 200 rows. And it's really deep in thought. There we go. Okay, so let's start with name. And for me, no lessons complete without a Star Trek reference. So Jim Kirk. Email is jim@kirk.com. Address is 123 Enterprise Way. Let's say he's 33. Let's associate him with flight number 1. Let's just say that first flight, that'll be his num. Now we're kind of hard coding this information. All right. Typically in an application we would have drop downs that would link things together. We'd have a foreign key constraint and so on. Right. Next one will be Mr. Spock. Email is mr@spock.com. And we'll say he's at 456 Vulcan Road. His age is 123. He's taking flight number 3. Notice these are ID numbers for the flight table. Third one, Bones McCoy. And he's at bones@mccoy.com. And we're looking at 789 Dr. Way. Age 35. Flight number 2 is what he's taking. And Montgomery Scott. And we'll say monty@scott.com. And we'll say 987 Engineer Road. Age 30. Flight 4. And so that'll be our data for the tables. Okay, so we've learned how to insert data now by hand. Okay, everything is saved. There's no Control S needed because it's just saving on the fly as we are entering information in. What we may want to consider doing is displaying this information. So I could just close these off. Let's close off everything here. Now, if I want to see what data is in the table, I just have to right-click on that table and say select top 1,000 rows. Now, this top 1,000 or top 200 that we see here, those can be modified in the settings. We can have however many we want. Okay, we can change that. That's modifiable. But let's just choose select top 1000 rows, and it's going to display all the information we have. It's not editable. It's not editable. Okay, but we can view it. And notice this window pops up here. This is actually a open space for us to type in SQL code. So I could take this select statement, so it says select top 1000. I could drop the top 1000 here, but maybe at the end I'll modify this and I'll just say where ID equals 1. And let's see what happens. All right, so we say where ID equals 1. There's an execute button here I can click on, and it'll just refresh and just show me that first ID. Right, so this is modifiable. Okay, if I want to view the other table, I can right click on flight num and say select top 1000 rows. Now my flight info comes back. Okay, and if I want to edit, I want to go back and insert more stuff, I can just right click on, let's say I right click on user info, and I could say edit top 200 rows. Right, and so I can come back to this window. Right, so this is how I can edit, select, view stuff and stuff like that. Okay. Now, if I want to have my own custom query, let's close this up. I'm not going to save it, but if I want to do a new query, just click on New Query. Right, gives me this blank space here, and so I can just say select star from flight info. And I'll just hit execute. And it'll do the same thing. Okay? And I won't save it, because I can save these queries. Okay, so at this point we've learned how to insert data and view data. Okay? Now, in the beginning of this discussion, we talked about users, right? So we talked about having our own customized user. So let's go ahead and add that user. So we did that change to have SQL Server authentication and Windows authentication, right? So let's actually add a user that we can use. What we can do is we'll look at our database here and notice that there's a folder here that says security. And right below it, there's another folder that says security. Okay? Both security folders have some purpose, but they're related. Right? The idea is that this folder here has security settings related to the particular database, and this folder security has settings related to the entire system. So we're going to start with the entire system and expand security. And you notice that there's logins, server roles, and so on. And if I expand logins, I'll have a bunch of different logins here. Now, by default, you probably have basically your Windows login and some other system logins by default, whatever they are. I want to add a new user. So I'll right-click on logins, and I'll say new login. Right? When I right-click on login, I have here login name, but I have these radio buttons. So Windows authentication, SQL Server authentication. I'm going to choose SQL Server authentication so I can have my own custom SQL Server user. Now I can go ahead and create a user. So I'm going to choose Jim Gordon as my username. And this is, I'm not using spaces here. So Jim Gordon. Password, you can make one up. I'm going to use Batman. And Batman. I should use something more secure, of course. Use an uppercase letter, use a number, mix in a hashtag or some punctuation. But I'm going to keep it simple for this exercise here. So Batman's going to be my password. All right. Below it, I have enforced password policy, enforced password option. I'm going to uncheck this. We should have them checked. We should have the user change the password. We should have all these things in place. But for this small little exercise, let's undo it so we're not running into any extra headaches. Okay. Now, down here under default database, we have master. We're going to change that to be specific to a particular database, we're going to choose net class. Okay? We're going to choose net class as our default database when the user logs in. Now, there's one more thing to do. We have to give this user permissions. Okay? So we're going to go here on the side, and it says here user mapping. We're going to choose user mapping, and we're going to select our table, like our database again, so net class, and we're going to make a DB owner. So it gives us full access to everything, DB owner. So we can do read, write, execute, whatever we want, right? And now we can hit OK. And now it's going to give us a new user. If you do not see Jim Gordon here, you can right-click on Logins and go refresh, and you should see it, right? And if you go back to the security folder that's associated with your database, you expand that, under Users, you should see Jim Gordon as well. And you can also modify his rights by going back to Jim Gordon and saying properties. And you come back to this window, right, with all the information that you had. But we're not going to modify anything. All right? So let's test out this user. So I'm going to disconnect. So I'm going to use this icon here to say disconnect. And I'm disconnected from the database. I'm going to reconnect. So the button next to it is reconnect. And I have local. I'm going to change this to SQL Server authentication. I'm going to type in my username, which is Jim Gordon. And password is Batman. And I'm going to hit connect. And so now it's going to log me in. It looks exactly the same. I see every single database, which I'm not sure is a good thing. But I can see every single database on the system. But if I try and access everything, like if I try and access this other table, it says I don't have access. It's not accessible because I don't have rights to it. But if I go to net class, which is what I'm associated with, I am allowed to view this database. All right, so at this point, we've covered how to create a user and how to log in with that user. Let's look back at our table and talk about one last thing, which is the foreign key constraint. So in our table, we have here flight num, we have here user info. And if we look at user info has a column called flight num. It's an ID number, and it's supposed to be the same column as the ID number from the flight info. So suppose we wanted to add a foreign key constraint to link two columns together, right? So what we can do is modify one of the tables. We should modify user info because we want to add the foreign key constraint to user info. So I'm going to right click on user info and say design. Okay. I'm going to say design. And I don't want to change anything here. Everything's perfectly fine. If I want to add a foreign key constraint, I'll look at my menu options at the top and I'll see Table Designer. In Table Designer, there is an option called Relationships. If I choose Relationships, I'm going to hit a window here and I'm going to hit Add. It's going to create a new relationship for me. Okay. Now it'll auto-generate a name, but don't worry about the name. If I go to this second option here, table and column specification, and I click here, a ... appears. Little icon ... If I click on that, a new window pops up, and this allows me to map what I want to map. So on the right-hand side, I have here user info and ID, which is fine. I want the primary key to be chosen to be flight info and ID. So I want to map flight info's ID column to user info's not ID column, but its flight num column. So I want the flight num from user info to be mapped to the flight info's ID column. And if I hit OK, Looks okay so far. Hit close. It generated a foreign key constraint. Now, how do we know that it actually worked? Well, there's actually a nice thing here in this database engine. It's like a visual diagram that we can have access to. We're going to have access to this visual diagram in Visual Studio eventually, but we can also generate it here. And this will be the last thing we'll talk about today, but if we look at this database diagrams folder, and if I try and expand it, it's going to give me a pop-up message that says database does not have one or more support objects required to use database diagramming. Do you wish to create them? I'm going to say yes. At this point, this will pop up and it'll say which tables to use. So I'll just hit flight info, hit add, and I'll hit user info, hit add, and hit close. And look, it's put my tables in a visual format. And this line here basically represents, it says relationship FK, so foreign key constraint, between the two tables. So now I have a visual diagram of my database tables. So pretty convenient tool to have at our disposal for viewing our database and how it looks. So at this point, we've looked at a bit of a crash course on SQL Server using SQL Management Studio and using this graphical utility to be able to access tables, create databases, create users, log in with users, create relationships, enter data, select data, create our own custom query. And from here, at this point now, we're going to move into creating apps that will access and modify this database engine.